Greetings and salutations, fratres et sorores in lukes of all kinds, of the north, of the south, of the east, of the west. From here in Los Angeles, when I look to the west, I'm looking at the east, and when I look at the east, I'm looking at the west. The world goes round and round, whatever, east, west, it's all the same to me. The Esoterinerd podcast, episode 2, in which I interview Kess Frey. He is the author of Centering Prayer and Rebirth in Christ on the Tree of Life, which he dedicated to my dad, as well as another man named Jim Gordon, both of whom set Kess on the path toward studying Hermetic Kabbalah and the Tree of Life. He also wrote The One Who Loves Us, Human Ground, Spirit Ground, The Creation of Reality. Born January 22nd, 1945, he grew up here in Eagle Rock. Well, I'm in Highland Park, right next to Eagle Rock in northeastern Los Angeles. He attended Eagle Rock junior and senior high schools, went to Pasadena City College, where he met my dad in the 1960s. He studied Eastern and Western philosophy, psychology, and religion with special interests in meditation and depth psychology. His main spiritual teachers, Lama Anagarika Govinda and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, as well as Swami Amar Jyoti and Father Thomas Keating, and he'll be talking about some of them in the interview coming up. But before that, I thought it might be fun to introduce you to something I call Theoricus Poker. If you are an Esoterinerd or you aspire to be an Esoterinerd and you have a friend of a similar ilk, then you might try Theoricus Poker. Basically, you just have to know all of the correspondences. We all have one or two special tarot decks wrapped in silk that we use for reading or pathworking or whatever, but don't we all have a few decks lying around that just basically do nothing but collect dust? And every once in a while we bring them out and look at them and go, oh yeah, this deck. Here's a fun way that we can turn these old decks into a game that we can use to drill correspondences, to stay sharp. Divide the 78 cards evenly among however many people you're playing with. So if you have 2, you each get 39. If you have 3, you all get 26. At a certain point, you'll probably have to set the extra ones aside in a discard pile. Maybe everybody gets to know what they are. Basically, it works like this. Whoever has the Fool card lays it down in the middle. The person to their left has to lay down a card that connects to it. So they could put down a king and say, well, that's absolute, that's Keter, it's connected to the Fool. They could put down a sword. Well, it's air, it's the Fool. They could put down an ace. 1, Keter, connected to the Fool. They could put down a 2, it's connected to Chokmah. They could put down Justice, Libra, ruled by air, all F, the Fool. The Star, or Lovers, the 3 signs of the zodiac ruled by air, the element of the Fool. Any good Esoterinerd would probably argue that any wand would correspond with absolute and therefore be connected with the Fool. Then whatever card that second person put down, the third person has to put down a card connected to it. So if they put down Aquarius, saying it was ruled by air, the next person could put down any 7. 7 of Pentacles, 7 of Swords, 7 of Cups, 7 of Wands, whatever. It's Venus that's connected to Aquarius, since Aquarius connects Netzach with Yesod. Speaking of Yesod, any 9. The Moon card, even though it's ruled by Pisces. The High Priestess, since it's ruled by the Moon. You get where it's going. Let's say someone puts something down, and you're playing, no matter, even if it's not your turn, you can call bullshit on it. You can say, okay, that's not connected. And then the person has to pick up the whole deck, and whoever runs out of cards first wins. But if you call bullshit, and the other person can explain how they're connected, then you end up with the whole deck. So if you're a beginner, you don't want to call bullshit. Not until you really know how to play the game. What happens if somebody picks up the whole deck? You've already played the Fool, right? So who's got the Magician? Has anybody got the Magician? Somebody puts down the Magician. Goes with any king, or 8 for Mercury. Goes with any ace, or 3, the Sephiroth it connects to. Goes with the Lovers. Goes with Hermit, both ruled by Mercury. Goes with Wand, primal element. Goes with the Sword, element of the planet. Maybe it's too stretchy. And then there's the Shem correspondences to consider. The 5 of Pentacles, the 3 of Cups, the 10 of Pentacles, the 8 of Wands, the 8 of Swords. You get where this is going. This isn't a rule book kind of thing. I'm not going to hold your hand through this, but if you Google Theoricus Poker, you'll find the original blog post in which I suggested that possible use for these old decks. Anyhow, just a little something fun before we move on to the main course. I hope everybody's well. It's been less than a week. I felt that that first episode warranted a second episode coming out, because I think that people who don't know me would be like, yeah, it's some guy in a fancy outfit, but then he's just talking to his like stepdad and talking about old times or whatever. And anybody is welcome to call and we'll talk about whatever. But I wanted to use this old interview. This is actually from last year in October. Kess Frey, my dad's old friend and fellow esotericist, they both were into Eastern and Western esotericism, which is, of course, where I get it. So I'm kind of second-generation Esoterinerd. Kess was in town, and I was particularly interested in any insight he might have about my dad and his esoteric background in context, and things I might not know about. So that's one of the things I asked him about, but I also asked him about his background and experience with those who've influenced him. And so, without further ado, here's the interview. This is Monday, October 27th, 1:37 p.m. This is Edward Reib talking. I am interviewing Kess Frey. So you were talking about the Karmapa being very different in his previous life?
Yes.
What was different about him?
Well, I didn't have much personal contact with him, but the impression, that I've gotten that as the supreme leader of the Karjupta order, he was more authoritarian and directive. And the new one seems to be reaching out to people in the West and communicating to us in our language.
Although his predecessor did send, what was his name? Charum? I can never say.
Chogyam Trungpa.
Chogyam Trungpa.
He was one of my teachers.
Yeah.
I did have personal contacts with him on a number of occasions.
Nice.
And there was another renowned teacher named Kalu Rinpoche, who the Dalai Lama called the 20th century Milarepa. And I also had contact with this Kalu Rinpoche. He was a very enlightened being. Trungpa was kind of controversial because he felt like if you want to teach Westerners, you need to become super Western. So while he was teaching, he was smoking cigarettes, drinking beer and other alcoholic substances.
No wonder Gordon likes him so much.
A lot of people just couldn't handle that because that didn't meet their expectation of what a holy man or a guru was supposed to be doing.
So he's very different from Chokdu Tolku?
Oh yeah, I would say extremely different. Well, Trungpa went to Oxford University and studied psychology to become familiar with Western culture before he started teaching, at least teaching in America. And so he was very controversial. And I was at a teaching at one of his centers in San Francisco that Kalu Rinpoche was giving. And he worked through a translator. Trungpa had learned English. Mm-hmm. And one of the people, I guess, who had been disgruntled with Trungpa said to Kalu Rinpoche, how can somebody like Chogyam Trungpa be a spiritual teacher we can respect when he carries on the way he does, drinking and smoking and other things? And Kalu Rinpoche's comment was, it's often very difficult for unenlightened sentient beings to understand Buddha activity. So he was very supportive of Trungpa, even though Kalu Rinpoche was kind of a model of asceticism. He spent 12 years meditating in
that's it.
in
Is
caves.
that him?
No, that's Chokdu Tulku.
Oh, different. Okay.
Yeah, that's a different lineage. He's a Nyingma Pa.
Oh.
And Kalu Rinpoche was a Karjupta, which is what the Karmapa, he's the head of that order. There's these different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. The Nyingma Pa is the old ones, and that's the school that was founded by Padmasambhava and Yeshe Tsogyal. She recorded all of his teachings, and they buried and hid a lot of them. And then there's the Karjupta school, which was begun through Marpa and Milarepa a few centuries later.
Have you seen this one?
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is one of the biographies of, I'm not sure if I've seen this exact one, but
yeah, I read
this
that
is one of the biographies of Padmasambhava.
Yeah, the Lotus Born by, how do you pronounce her name?
How I pronounce it, that's not how everybody else necessarily does, is Yeshe Tsogyal.
Okay. Yeah, I've been saying Yishi Tsyokal.
Yeshe means wisdom in
Okay.
Tibetan. I'm not sure what the meaning of Tsogyal is.
Right. Maybe it was a family name or something.
But she attained enlightenment, in a female body, and was very highly renowned.
Yeah, I've got a statue of her in my yoga room.
I have kind of a connection to her myself.
Yeah.
So, anyway, there's those two schools, and then there's another school that came along after that was the Gelugpa, and that's the one that the Dalai Lamas are in.
Right. So the Gelugpa, what's his relationship to the Karmapa? Because they seem to work together.
Well, they're like, you could compare them on a political level to the President of the United States and the President of Canada.
Oh.
Or the Prime Minister of Britain. I mean,
they get along.
They're heads of major orders and they cooperate.
Right.
They're all working towards the same thing. Chogyam Trungpa, I think, was the 12th Trungpa Tulku. So and there's another, she passed away in 1987, and there's another reincarnation of him in Tibet right now that's growing up. There's a reincarnation of Kalu Rinpoche. There's reincarnations of many lamas. The Dalai Lama is certainly a prime example of that.
Yeah, 14 of
and
them.
There's been many Karmapas, but he's the first one that decided to go outside his lineage in such a big way and offer teachings to people in other cultures, like America, more in our language. So he's not teaching Buddhism per se, but he's teaching kind of a spirituality which is based on Buddhist principles. But he's not trying to win converts to Buddhism.
Right.
Maybe that's the unique thing about him that they were referring to.
Yeah.
Probably.
What's this book you have here?
Oh, this is a book called The Ageless Wisdom, and this is a little more in the Western mystery tradition, but I've read this book. I think it's a wonderful overview of the Ageless Wisdom. It's by a teacher who was an Armenian named Torquem Saradarian. It's kind of in the tradition of the teachings of Alice Bailey. There's like a Tibetan who dictated a series of books to Alice Bailey. She was involved in the Theosophical movement.
Okay.
In the latter 19th and early 20th century. And then after Madame Blavatsky and I think Annie Besant had disappeared, there was kind of a schism within the Theosophical movement.
And what year about?
1920-ish.
Okay.
And Alice Bailey, their headquarters was in Hollywood, here in SoCal. Mm-hmm. Alice Bailey was kind of conflicted about which camp, the schism to go to, because she liked the people in both of them.
Right.
Often there are these egotistical power struggles in spiritual organizations, just like there is in the business world, the political world, and other places because of people's egos.
Yeah.
So Alice Bailey was wondering what to do, and all of a sudden she was like in her apartment or whatever, and this voice started speaking to her, telling her, you're not to go with either of those camps, but we have a special line of teaching to pass through you. And so Jwal Khul is the name of the Tibetan, they call him the Tibetan. He's supposed to be one of the masters of the spiritual hierarchy. And when she was younger, she had an experience. She has an unfinished autobiography that I read. When she died, I think in 1948, she had an experience where another one of those masters of the hierarchy actually manifested to her, and that's what got her started on her spiritual journey and led to the breakup of her marriage, and a lot of different things happened. And she was British. She spent some time in British colonial India, And then she came to the United States. And so she went on quite a journey. And then she was contacted by this teacher, and he dictated a series of books to her. And it's a continuation of what was started in the teaching, like the secret doctrine, theosophy.
Right.
And it's very kind of heady stuff, but really interesting. I haven't read the whole library of it.
Yeah.
There's an organization called the Lucis Trust, which is the trust of her work. And they have a headquarters in New York City and one in Geneva, Switzerland. And there was a woman that I met up in Anchorage, an older woman, through a place called the Adam Center, where Adam stands for Ancient Teachings of the Masters.
Mm.
And we became good friends. She was older than me, but she had gone through the complete course of study of all the teachings presented through Alice Bailey's books, and had a complete collection of it. And in her meditation, she was having contact with this Tibetan, she told me. But anyway, this guy, the author of this book, was also a teacher of hers. Mm-hmm. She was at that time living in Southern California, and she started going to his teachings when he was teaching out of his garage in the San Fernando Valley someplace. She thought very highly of him. And what he teaches is in that same line of teaching. So that's kind of a little bit of background. But I would say in this book, he gives a really concise, readable, and accurate summary of what that's all about. So this is a very important introduction to that teaching, and it's really an important part of Western esotericism. A lot of people, particularly people that have been focused on the Golden Dawn like you have, may not have heard much about.
Right.
But it's very important. In fact, Paul Foster Case, who started the VOTA, he was friends with Alice Bailey when she was here living here in Los Angeles, because they were contemporaries.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, you read about that in that biography I've recommended about his life.
Oh,
the life and
autobiography.
Teaching of it's the life and teaching of Paul Foster Case. The author's name is Paul Clark.
Oh, the one who started the other order, the first of the schisms.
There was, when the BOTA had its little
Hidden Light
schism, or whatever you would call it, he split off, but he was entrusted with all this information.
The FLO, right?
About Paul Foster Case.
Yeah.
And he kept that quiet, and then finally decided, after, 40 years or something, to make it available to people by putting together this biography of Paul Foster Case and the transcript of several communications that he and Ann Davies and Harriet Case had with this Master Recoil, also known as Count Saint-Germain, who's one of the masters of this same hierarchy that Joel Kuhl, and they have different names.
Interesting.
There's a teacher named Moria, a Master Moria, who supposedly was, in one of his previous incarnations, the gospel writer known as Paul.
Okay.
Or Saint Paul. So he has a very fiery personality.
Yeah.
And this teacher was kind of that way too, because he was a direct
I was curious.
physical plane student of his.
You were mentioning the Theosophical Society and the connection to Tibetan. My dad's teacher, Andrew de Fasano, in the 80s, I did some research and found out that his teacher, or one of his teachers, was the secretariat of the Italian chapter of the Theosophical Society. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I wasn't sure if you had any insight into his background, because he's sort of a mystery. I got to meet his other students, and everybody was just asking each other, do you know anything about him? Do you know anything about him?
Well, I met him once through your dad. He wanted me to hear this guy teach, and so he took me and another friend of his named Runyon or something.
Poke Runyon.
Poke Runyon, that's his name.
Mm-hmm.
Who I'd never met before.
Mm-hmm.
Your dad, John Dan Reib, and Poke Runyon and myself, we went over to the Philosophical Research Society.
Mm-hmm.
and Andrew De Pisano, gave a presentation.
Nice.
So that was, the one time that I had contact with him. Didn't talk with him very much.
And he did a meditation, right?
He led us in some meditations, and he was in, some basic teachings.
Yeah.
I didn't take those up because I was occupied with things I'd been doing.
Right.
Very interesting. Something that I could tell you regarding your dad, Andrew De Pisano, was that your dad told me this, that Andrew De Pisano physically asked him, could I borrow some energy from you? He asked your dad that, and your dad said, sure, you can borrow some energy from me. And then, and this actually may have contributed to your dad's death. I don't know, but then astrally, Andrew De Pisano came to your dad and took energy. And then he came back and he looked and he saw what he had done, and he says, oh my God, like he was shocked that I guess he had taken too much or something. And it wasn't a good thing, it affected your dad's well-being and his health.
Huh. I didn't know about that. When was that?
It was the same year he died. Was it 93 when he passed away?
Really? Huh.
It was the last time I saw your dad. I was down here visiting, and he told me about this.
Wow.
That this guy had asked permission, and your dad gave it to him, thinking it would be a rather harmless thing to do. But
I know that toward the end of his life, Andrew was trying a lot of things because he was battling cancer. Yeah. And at one point, he went down to, I believe it was Colombia, for a certain sacred agave plant. And he was communing with the plant for a long time. And that had something to do with something he was trying to fight the cancer. And so, yeah, he seemed to be in a desperate place of wanting to live longer. And
yeah, which in a way makes you wonder about how well prepared he was for his transition.
Yeah.
And my belief is this, that we are intended to stay in these bodies and live our physical lives as long as it's possible for us to continue evolving spiritually. And at some point, we reach a point where we can't really grow anymore, accomplish anymore, work off more karma, whatever the different things are we're intended to be doing in this incarnation. And at that point, it's time to leave.
Yeah.
Because we have to continue on the inner planes, and then again, for the vast majority of us, in another human incarnation. And one should accept that with grace and be ready for it.
Wasn't one of Andrew's primary goals in learning this stuff was to extend his life?
Yeah.
I remember.
And I think that was one of the things he was teaching, one of the things in the ad that he put out.
He was in his 80s when he borrowed the energy from your dad, Edward's dad. I almost said your dad, but your dad-in-law, I guess I would say.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but he borrowed the energy at John. It seems like what happened is that Andrew De Pisano now owes a karmic debt to your dad.
Right.
Which he will have to repay in a future incarnation, most likely.
Yeah.
But your dad wasn't happy about it. And he just said that he trusted, that...
Yeah, it was his teacher.
No harm
he loved and respected
come
him.
to him from this, yeah. And he wanted to help the guy, but he just took him on. I know nothing about that, by the way. And I've heard of, your dad referred to prana leeches, as I'm sure you know real well.
Yeah.
There are people that are prana leeches, and there's people that are like astral vampires and stuff. But generally, without your consent, they can't take your energy.
Right, but with your consent.
But with your consent, then you've
invited the vampire in.
Yeah, if that's a vampire, you've invited it in. And that's a kind of a scary
wow, that gives me a whole
thing
new,
to contemplate.
A whole new perspective on Andrew. Because I'd never heard anything but positive before about Andrew.
Well, it definitely affected my perspective on him, and I was never personally involved with him, so I didn't have a real attachment to him, in a positive way.
The one thing I remember Andrew said, looking at me, he says, "You have a very bright papa," which is interesting, thinking in context of what you just told me, of kind of a double entendre of bright as in intelligent. But he was talking about auras. Your father's very bright in the world. He's very...
Well, I think both of those are very true of John Dan.
Yeah.
He was a force. No question about it.
Yeah.
He was a force, and he was bright. And as I told you last time I was here, this woman up by Lake Arrowhead named Elaine, when I asked her after your dad had passed away about him, she said that he was needed on the inner planes for some important spiritual work with energy that was affecting the future evolution of consciousness on this planet, and that he had actually been allowed a few more years than was originally planned. Now that's a whole other take or perspective on the thing, as opposed to Andrew de Pisano taking too much energy.
Have you been to Eastwick Village?
No.
I recommend before you go, in fact, we could go, if you want today, later, my dad's third wife.
Was that Susan?
Yeah. She opened a store called Eastwick Village.
Yeah, I told them.
Yeah, in Sierra Madre, where my dad grew up and where he lived. She said that she was in contact with my dad for a long time. After a year, I would go over after a year, and she would say, "Oh, well, your dad, John said this afternoon, and I'd be like, "Oh, that's interesting. Okay." She now has a husband, Greek husband. But I go visit her every now and then.
Well, today would be the day, because I'm leaving Thursday, and I've got other things I'm going to be doing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, maybe later on after
maybe
Diane
when Diane
arrives.
gets here.
I have a friend who might be joining us for the ritual work later on.
I can stay here in case
She comes back. Okay. The store has that. When you walk in, you see that redwood stain that my dad had on everything, or that cherry wood stain color, and statues of Buddha and the incense. She was controversial. She was called a Satanist. There was letters given to all the churches. There was a woman who ran the angel store, the little angel knickknacks across the store, who was trying to get her, since she became the manager, she became the building manager, Sue. And she said, "Well, you've got the keys. Why don't we go spy on so-and-so's new store?" And Sue said, "No, that's, unethical. That's immoral." And so the other woman, disappeared, and then suddenly these letters started showing up at the local churches saying Susan Reib is the devil worshiper.
Run your competition out of town by getting them condemned. Burned at the stake, if possible.
So I went to the local Catholic church there, and at the time I was singing in a Catholic, Russian Catholic choir.
Yeah.
And I went and introduced myself to one of the nuns there, and I told her about Sue, and I told her that, times are changing. Like, people who are very Christian oriented, who think that Buddhists are devil worshippers, are wrong. And, my stepmother is a Buddhist, and she believes in Buddhist principles. And she sells items of a Catholic nature, of a Buddhist nature, of a Jewish nature, primarily. There isn't really anything else. There's no witchcraft going on, And she's being called a devil worshiper. And so I told her this, and I said, all I want from you is if you could just tell the Monsignor that I spoke to you. And if you have any kind of contact with the other churches, because I know they all got the letter. And so I did what I could.
Well, since Vatican II, the Church officially recognized that other religions are valid paths to God.
Exactly, yeah. It's the really ignorant people who are still on an old script from
people that are way back in that traditional...
like the equivalent maybe of...
pre-modern stage.
Like Tibetan that would say, you better use this every day or else.
Exactly, and that's exactly the kind of thing that Diane said, that the stuff he was putting on people, the guilt and the threat of hell if you don't do the practice every day, to her was equivalent to the type of fear that they tried to instill in her when she was going to a parochial Catholic school in the 1950s, a child. And it's like trying to control you by fear rather than opening
love.
you to the love, which is
Yeah.
what the message of
Has
Christ
always
is all
been.
about.
Yeah.
It's love and freedom. It's not intimidation and terrorism, on a spiritual level. Well, here, why don't you take this book?
Thank you.
I'm sure both of you will find it interesting to read.
I wanted to, before I forget, my dad talked about flesh-placed fear junkies, in his book.
Oh, that's...
That one of the things that come to mind when I think about those ideas is that if somebody dies and all they can think about is, oh, where's my body? I gotta stretch, or even I need a cigarette, or I need to slam some heroin, like in order to have that addiction, whatever it is, I need lust, I need sex, or whatever it is. They find themselves slammed back into a body, and possibly one that, they didn't take the time to choose their parents. They just said, who's available? And maybe ended up somewhere unpleasant. And I noticed that Karmapa, in his 16th incarnation, died in 1981 and was born in 1985, the same year as my wife. What was it, the year of the... Wood Ox. Well, anyhow, so that made me think he spent 3 years in the Bardo. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, about if there's a connection between the amount of time between incarnations and perhaps the level of consciousness or level of enlightenment of the being and their decision to stay in the Bardo longer.
Well, with the exception of these Bodhisattva tulkus who choose to keep reincarnating, they're not reincarnating because of the karmic need to, because they have lessons to learn or whatever, but they're simply reincarnating to be of service to the spiritual development of humanity. And I believe that they wait until the right time arrives, the right circumstances for an appropriate incarnation.
Yeah.
And so in terms of our physical time, it could be shorter or longer, but it's usually within a few years or so, but it may need to be longer, depending on what their mission is going to be when they come back.
Yeah.
And I think they're in a very different category than most of us, who are evolving, and we need to reincarnate in order to work out karma and to learn lessons and to grow spiritually. But still, our soul will choose circumstances in which we have the best possible chance to continue growing spiritually. But if somebody's a flesh-placed fear junkie, and they're so strongly desiring to fulfill carnal addictions, whatever they are,
even negative ones, like
even
fear.
Negative ones,
Yeah.
or fear, or even hatred.
Yeah. I'm going to go back and fight in a war.
Exactly. I know of a case of that.
MacArthur?
Of somebody that was a jihadist, was a brother of somebody that I knew who I was working with in jail. A person from...
He wasn't an inmate, by the way.
Belarus. I wasn't an inmate, but the person I was working with was.
Yeah.
And his brother had gotten shot. He'd shot plenty of people, too.
Right.
And I asked my sister, to ask her guides about this person, and what information she got was that he can't wait to reincarnate so he can continue fighting in the jihad. He was a fanatical Islamist.
My parents, when I was very young, one of them, I forget, I think it was my mom, they told me that, according to the Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that when I die, I'll be faced with two lights, and one of them is bright and terrifying, and the other one is softer and yellow and warm and comforting.
Dull.
And that if I, in my fear of the bright light and my desire to get away from it, go toward the soft light, I'll find myself in another body. And if I go toward the bright light, I'll find myself in the higher planes. And from there, you can still incarnate, but when you do on purpose for a reason. But if you just go to the warm light, You just get a body. You got to keep going. You get whatever, astrological blueprint you need to work out some more karma.
Yeah, that seems to be the basic teaching of that book, which was authored by Padmasambhava and written down by A.C. Solyo. It's called the Bardo Photo, which means liberation by hearing. So the idea and the way that was originally done was that after a person who had been in that culture and been in that religion and had studied these teachings and had been practicing yoga and meditation type yoga, preparing for this, they were supposed to have that read to them while they were dying and after they had died. And it says that when you first die, when physical death first takes place, there's this dawning of the clear light, which is the pure, luminous radiance of enlightenment, uncreated reality. And the ego, the separate self sense, will recoil in fear from that light because it senses that it will be dissolved if it goes into that light.
Yeah.
But if someone is prepared for that, according to that book, it's possible to attain liberation and enlightenment by allowing your consciousness to merge into that clear light.
Yeah, because you don't have a body anymore. That's something that makes me think of taking acid. Because when you're there, you're standing there, and everything that's around you really comes across as being an extension of self. All right.
Almost tripped over that. Yeah, I'm okay.
There's a duality happening, but it's a harmonious duality where you realize that it's just happening. There's this polarity between what I get to control, my hands, and then what gets controlled by the other. But really, and even looking at the brain, given what little we know still in 2014, there's this portion of the brain that is basically the recording of the other, and there's the acting self. But the one thing that was pointed out at Boda maybe a year ago, by a woman who, what was her name? She passed away. Troya Patch. She had pointed out, while talking about the universe card on Saturn, that the portion of the brain that records one's own present time facial expressions and voice is the same mechanism that records the facial expressions and voice of others. And so, neurologically, the ego, the self, sense of self, and the sense of others is the same mechanism. Mm-hmm. Which blew my mind. and she was looking right at me at one point, and then afterwards someone said, have you guys met? And we said, we know each other, but we haven't been properly introduced. And then I found out she passed away, and it doesn't feel like she passed away because of the nature of the little, interaction I had with it.
Well, it's interesting that you had mentioned that psychedelic experience made you think of the descriptions of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because one of the first texts, I don't know if you know this or not, but one of the first texts that was written as a guidebook for people having psychedelic experiences was called The Psychedelic Experience. It's put together by Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner, who were all at Harvard University in the early 1960s. And it's based on the Bardo Thodo, on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And they actually guide you into this experience of the clear light and these other realms that you can go into.
The difference being you come down afterward. But if you're dying and you're in the Bardo,
it's a one-way deal.
Then you can dissolve into it. When you're on acid and you're peaking, you want to dissolve into it, but you can't, but it's okay. And then you come down and you accept that death is going to come later. But it's interesting to think about confronting the experience and being there and actually having the option to dissolve this thing I call Edward into this thing I call God. The other.
In my memoir there's a few attempts to recreate some of those experiences. So.
In the Divine Pymander of Hermes, chapter 2, it refers to it's a conversation between Hermes, I believe, I might be a little off, and Pomander, Poemander, and it reminds me of that same sort of psychedelic, as they say, knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, or the communion between self and other that you can get to in a very deep meditative sort of trance, or in a psychedelic experience sometimes, or even just sometimes. I mean, maybe they call it an acid flashback, but there's many people I don't know if you've read the. I'll just go off on a trip and then I'll ask you another question. But in the DMT, the Spirit Molecule, the book by. Oh no, that was Jeremy Narby was the Cosmic Serpent knowledge. DNA on the Origins of Human Knowledge, which is also I recommend. But DMT, the Spirit Molecule. While I'm recommending books, the Hermetic Code in DNA by, do you remember? Well, that's another good one. It's a little heady, and the thing with Hermetic Code in DNA is you'll hate it until you're about 2/3 of the way through, and then it starts to come together, and you're like, oh, I get it, why it's called DNA, because they're talking about the pyramids and all this other stuff, and you're like, okay, yeah, when are you going to get to the DNA thing? Because I'm reading this because I perceived Kabbalistic correspondence, well, other people see them too, who are into numerology and things, and Hebrew letters will discover in DNA. I'll just run it through real quick, and we'll both have a copy of this interview, that you can correspond. The way I do it, I don't know if anybody else has done this, but I have it on blogs and things. Thymine is spirit, uracil is fire, and then there's what's the opposite of the one that bonds with thymine? There's adenine, cytosine, and guanine. So adenine would then be water, and cytosine and guanine, one of them is earth and one of them is air, and I have it written down. I based it on which one's a purine and which one's a pyrimidine, but it eludes me at the moment.
So this is all physical chemistry.
Physical chemistry grafted with Hermetic correspondences. And so, of course, I was interested in a book called Hermetic Code in DNA, but it never did it get anywhere near what I was talking about. But so I developed an alphabet of DNA language based on sigil drawing, the traditional Golden Dawn method of drawing sigils, on a regular sort of equal-armed cross. But the upshot is that that thymine is only found in the nucleus. Spirit is only found in the heart. When it wants to send a message out to the rest of the tree of life, or to the ribosomes, for instance, it uses messenger RNA. And so uracil replaces thymine's role. So rather than thymine bonding with adenine, which it does in the DNA, uracil will bond with adenine. And so when it's sending a message, it uses fire, not spirit. It was sort of intuitive, the idea. It was sort of inspired and in a half sort of intuitive sort of state.
Very interesting.
But that and then it goes on and on and on, because the mitochondrial DNA comes from the mother's mother, and that's in every cell there is a mother, and that mother takes the nutrients that comes in from the cell membrane, from the channel proteins, and makes fucking dinner for the cell. Makes it into energy that's usable to keep the whole thing going, and that's the mother's DNA. So looking to me that corresponds with that you have a relationship with your digestive system where it has its own brain matter. It worked into it, and when it's hungry, it communicates it to us, and we communicate back. When we feel sad, we tell the digestive system, and it behaves differently than it does when we feel confident.
And the emotions definitely affect what's going on in the gut.
So there's a sort of a relationship happening in here, between, and so I was kind of cogging on this, and at a certain point when I was falling asleep, I was contemplating mitochondrial DNA. I had had a dream in which my mother was shouting at me from inside of a tent, and telling me that I was doing something wrong. And it was the first time I had cut out meat, and I wasn't taking iron, and I got really sick right after I had the dream. And so I started really getting into this, and we were talking about Chinese medicine and dream symbolism and the biochemical interpretation of dreams. So anyway, the point is that when I thought of all this at once, and I thought of my mother and her mother and her mother and her mother and her mother, and I thought of the mitochondrial DNA in all of the cells of my body, and I thought of my own digestive system, and then I just shined some golden light in this whole part of my body that I had been kind of ashamed of because it smells gross. You know what I mean? Just for a very shallow reason. That I was like, the digestive system, especially when I was unhealthy and drinking, and, it's just... what I put into it, it gives back, and so I go, ugh, gross, But I just said thank you and shined some golden love, and it shined it right back.
Oh, how beautiful.
And it was this figure 8 of golden light, and I got up and I wrote it down, and I tried to describe it in poetry, and then the last line was, and I'll never be the same. It's very beautiful, but I got off on a tangent.
An epiphany, though. You had a gut level spiritual epiphany.
But when the author ricked something of DNA, the spirit molecule, went to this particular Buddhist monastery, it's in the book. And the woman that was the second to the head, of it, was a friend of his, and she was just going to school, and then she took acid, and lo and behold, now she's got her head shaved, and she's been at this Buddhist monastery for all these years, because she knew that acid, which operates because of dimethyltryptamine, which is part of acid, was it was the shortcut. It was a shortcut, and it was and the people who had walked the long road to enlightenment knew about that shortcut, because it's not new. I mean, maybe LSD in particular is new, but psychedelics aren't new. Like taking a strong, potent dose of a drug to try to get the kundalini to raise before you are purified, before you're a proper vessel to receive it or be a healer, and you're going to use it for some other evil end. It's dangerous, and it's so people sometimes will cog on that, and but their original LSD, experiences LSD, and then it eventually becomes taking the long road of yoga and meditation.
Well, as Ram Dass put it, a person having a psychedelic experience with LSD or some other sacred substance, assuming that they use it that way, as a sacrament, in order to explore deep within themselves and to seek a deeper spiritual experience, that experience shows them the possibility of what's there for them. So it kind of serves as a wake-up mechanism. But then in order to get to the point where you can live in that place, you have to work on yourself. You have to overcome the inner obstacles, or what's called the false self system, for example, the things in us that are counter to those higher spiritual values. We need to outgrow our immaturities and our fixations on programs for happiness that don't work. And that's the work that needs to be done. And so a person undertakes various types of discipline. They may become a monastic, like this woman you were talking about, or whatever. Go through some type of therapy, work on their physical well-being and their emotional well-being and social well-being, mental, spiritual, psychic well-being, and so forth. Because as long as that work isn't done, we're carrying the dead weight of the false self system, and it's going to keep dragging us down, and it's actually going to create mixed motivations in our higher aspirations. There'll be part of us that really wants to go for the higher, but there's another part of us that just as much wants to go for these contrary, lower type of things. See, it's simply out of ignorance, not understanding oneself deeply and well. But as long as that is intact, people won't be able to really evolve and live in that higher place. You might say it's good to get high, but we also have to get clean in order to stay high.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
I like that.
Otherwise, we're going to be dragged down by our own impurities, our own neuroses.
I was thinking about the ideas put forth by many people, including Teilhard de Chardin, about the interconnection of human consciousness centers, brains, human beings, and communication through words, and then of course now through technology that exponentially has increased, where you can have a dialogue with a community which exists geographically in many places, but in their thought process, in their mode of reality, they are similar, and then they can really brainstorm and really. So one individual has the ideas of 300 people that they were just reading about that morning on Facebook, and or whatever it is, the potential for that exists. The point being, So in the 50s and 60s, the world brain, the collective consciousness,
the noosphere,
got a dose of LSD, and perhaps has triggered more of a general awakening toward that, hopefully. Each new person, grows up. I've seen, a lot of people, for example, someone who grows up in a racist Southern kind of, sort of environment, and then takes acid and goes, oh man, okay, come on. And then they go to college and they're looking through new eyes. And then they've transformed. It's like so it still is going on. There's ripple effects where it's still happening today, and having an effect similar to what it had happened to maybe people in colleges where they were doing those experiments.
And it was a minority of people who had these experiences. A lot of people were using those substances as recreational, fun type things, for entertainment, or for pleasure, different types, more superficial uses.
Yeah.
And then if someone isn't prepared, it's like you're opening a door to your unconscious that you can't close, and if there's material in the unconscious a person isn't ready to face and accept and assimilate, it can be a hellish, destructive experience, a frightful experience. And many people had those because they were totally unprepared and weren't really taking it seriously. They were using it in a very flippant,
the way they just maybe
shallow
smoke a
way.
joint, or
just go out and party as a party drug or something.
Yeah.
And it's a complete mistake, because something that could be potentially extremely valuable is degraded.
Yeah.
To a much lower level.
How did you meet my dad? I never heard that story.
Oh, I didn't tell you. I thought I told you.
Or maybe you did, but I forgot.
There was a student of his named Jim Gordon at Pasadena City College, who I was friends with. Mm-hmm. And I was there like in the school year of 1965 to 1966. Mm-hmm. And then I met Jim and became friends with him. And then I transferred to UC Irvine in the fall of '66, which was when your dad began teaching at PCC. And Jim was one of his students. And Jim got involved with him privately, studying about the Kabbalah and the Tarot and esotericism. In fact, Jim told me that he wanted to be an esotericist. I didn't know what that meant. So he introduced me to your dad. He says, you got to meet this guy, Reib. He said, he comes on really strong, but just, don't panic. Just hear him out, and he's really cool. And so I said, sure, I'd like to meet him. So the next time I was in the area, I met him. That's how I met him. Nice. Went over to his house, and he was talking about the tarot and a little bit about William Butler Yeats, and the Golden Dawn, and he had this friend named Jack Davison. I guess the two of them had tried to initiate themselves into the Kabbalah and the Tarot.
Nice.
And Jim was sort of their pupil. And he talked about Aleister Crowley, and just saying, stay away from him, because he really takes you down.
That was how I ended up in the Golden Dawn.
Down the wrong path.
Was that recommendation, because my mom remembered that. Yeah.
Crowley was a person that experimented with a lot of drugs. And I guess at some point, he just kind of walked off a cliff, and abused and overdid it. And he invoked spirits that were very destructive to him.
Yeah.
Thinking he was getting a lot of power. And one of his students, Crowley's students, was a well-known man from this part of the world named Israel Regardie. Mm. He has several books. You've probably heard of him. He wrote a book on the Golden Dawn, the Tree of Life, and the Garden of Pomegranates and stuff. And your dad told me that he had called up Israel Regardie, and he was going to go drive over and visit him. I think he was living like in North Hollywood or someplace like that. Mm-hmm. And he said that while he was driving over there, he kept seeing the image of Major Arcana 15, the devil, in front of him as he was driving over there. And then he said he went up and knocked on the door, and Regardie answered the door, and Regardie was proclaiming to him that Aleister Crowley was a god, he was a living god, and saying all this really positive
what
stuff
year was
about
that?
it.
60s?
I was in the 60s,
okay.
Yes. I can't with any certainty tell you which...
Oh, that's okay. I was just curious.
Which year it could have been.
Just wanted to... for the
67 or 68, or even possibly 69. I don't know.
Something like that.
When it was, but I was still living in Southern California. I moved to San Francisco in 69.
So, do you remember anything else he said about that interaction with Regardie? Because I've always been sort of curious about that. He mentioned it in the Transformations opening. He said, I should also mention a brief interaction I had with Israel Regardie.
I don't think he stayed there very long.
Yeah. The thing I remember was that he felt like a crow energy, like an intense crow energy. That was what my mom told me, and that Regardie wanted him to be his student, but he didn't like the energy. He didn't like that crow energy. But maybe that was Crowley. That was misremembering. Crow was saying that it was a Crowley energy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know really much about Regardie, but I guess he was an older guy because in the biography of Paul Foster Case, there's a couple of letters. They had some correspondence.
Yeah.
Between the two of them.
Yeah. Yeah, he's, what happened, one of the things that happened, the first that I know of, the first Golden Dawn reconstruction, the traditional Golden Dawn order made in modern times that I know of, was based on Regardie's published material that he had gotten through Stella Matutina, that he had gotten through Crowley, about the Golden Dawn. And they had a falling out because he had published it, and because according to some, there's a lot of different spins that I've heard on these things, but because Regardie wanted to preserve the original pure teachings that had existed that Crowley had learned and perverted, because Crowley immediately took the name Golden Dawn as soon as the schism had happened, and everybody went different directions, and Mathers and Moina changed their name to Alpha and Omega, and the other adepts, including, I believe, Yates, changed their name to Stella Matutina, Morning Star, referring to Jesus, not to Satan, of course, because it's a title for both, but anyway.
And Venus.
Yeah, and Venus. Which is the highest, in the original cipher manuscripts of the Golden Dawn, the highest grade was the grade of Venus, the grade of Netzach. And the initiates, when they went through and wrote it all out and made it flowery and put on costumes and enacted it, a bunch of people got up to that highest grade, And they were asking, well, what next, chiefs? And so they were saying, next is, of course, 5 equals 6, because it was 1 equals 10, 2 equals 9, 3 equals 8, 4 equals 7. So they said 5 equals 6. Well, how does that go? So they borrowed heavily from the Society of Rosenkreuz in Anglia, which they were all initiates of, and brought in some interesting stuff, because Budge was translating directly from hieroglyphs down at the British Museum, and they could just walk in and say, hey, what do you think about this? And so they were bringing in a lot of Egyptology and bringing ingenuity to it, literally bringing color where it was black and white before to the vault in many places. But anyway, so they invented 5 equals 6, and then a few people would burn out because they'd go from a ritual in which people were talking, I am Isis, the dew upon the branch, or stuff like that. And then all of a sudden they're tying people to a cross and whipping them and telling them, to evoke the avenging angel Hua to bring wrath upon them and dissolve their inner rose if they should go against the order and stuff. And so people would be like, this is fucked up, what is it? And so they invented another grade to go in between those grades, and they called it portal. And so that was consisted of working with the devil, the death, and temperance. But the whole point was, don't go down the devil path. Don't go down the death path. Temperance, but they talk a bit about what this symbolizes, and you got to work with those energies. But what Crowley did was he got way into these two side paths and didn't have much of the temperance.
Didn't have the middle path.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's in the sense of the 5 elements, there was the neophyte, which, it's a spiritual centering, so that was kind of, I always thought, could correspond to the element of spirit. And then there's the first grade, Zelator, for the second grade, and then Theoricus, air, and then Practicus, water, Philosophus, fire, and then so then he said, okay, now there's the spirit grade. You're a complete pentagram now. And so then to get from there, you transform the pentagram to a hexagram, and then you go into 5 equals 6. And so it was like this step in between where you start invoking Thoth, and Alan Bennett wrote out this Thoth invocation that Crowley loved, and so it's used equally in Golden Dawn orders and in Thalamin orders. And it goes at the end. Most of their big invocations at the end. Make all spirits subject unto me, so that every spirit of the firmament of the ether, upon the earth and under the earth, in dry land and in the water, of whirling air and of rushing fire, should be obedient unto me. And so
that could be quite an ego trip.
Yeah, which Paul Foster Case, of course, points out. And I mentioned that I was traditional Golden Dawn one time down at Boda, and they said, "Don't you find that it exalts the ego?" I said, "Yes, it does." But anyhow, I'm talking too much.
Well, I think you will really enjoy reading that biography of Paul Case.
Yeah.
Because it adds to the historical perspective on the Golden Dawn and how it evolved and in the instruction, the matter of the OTA as a way of carrying the tradition, the Western mystery school tradition of initiation that people could probably use in the West, in America, because he was an American. Yeah, I think he was the American head of the original Golden Dawn order. And then at some point he had a parting of the ways with
Moina,
the widow of McGregor.
Oh, but what I was getting to earlier was Regardi was a guy, he was in the OTO, he had an Oasis.
He's one of the people that had material for that biography, I believe.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Chick Cicero.
In the 80s, 70s, he had a strip club, and he's open about this, I'm not talking any trash about him. And one of the girls that worked there, he was liked. She's now his wife, and she writes many of the books, and has for many decades now. And she did the art, so it's sort of they got right into that vein of the tradition of like McGregor Mathers telling Moina what to paint, or she was scrying and finding the right color to use for some path on the Tree of Life in some particular scale, but he met Regardi. He wrote to him and said, I might be misremembering this, but he said, hey, I'm building the tools. I'm doing it. I'm building a vault. And Regardi was very excited because he didn't get a lot of fan letters, And so he said, I would love to see your vault. And so he came and visited. And they snapped a picture, which is in some of Chick Cicero's books, of Regardi standing in the vault, which it's funny because in the order I came from, you don't see the vault until you're ready. You only see it during ceremony. You're wearing a white robe and golden slippers, and you do a particular thing when you go in, and you behave a certain way when you're inside of it. And there's Regardi, like with his hands in his pockets, like looking around. Regardi himself didn't get past Practicus, but so we in our particular Golden Dawn enactment order would talk a lot of trash about that, especially in the olden days when we thought should be in competition with the Cicero order.
Yeah, the Regardi's letters to Paul Case, or Paul Case's letters to Regardi that are in that biography, they're written in the 1930s.
Interesting.
For example.
Yeah. I wonder how old he would have been. I'm sure it's easy enough to look up.
He probably would have been pretty old. I wanted to ask you while you were talking regarding vaults. You know, the vault that Paul Foster Case describes in his book, The True and Invisible Rosicrucian Order, he describes the vault of Christian Rosenkreuz.
Right.
And the symbolism of that. Is that anything like these vaults you're talking about?
For example, and this will tie in, I'm not going off on a trail too far, but in the second grade of the Golden Dawn Zelator, you are brought in as a Levitical priest into the not into the Holy of Holies, but into the tabernacle. And you're told that, that the ancient priests would wash their hands, and then they have you wash your hands, and then the ancient priests would make a sacrifice, and they burn smoke in front of you, and then they would walk through into the tabernacle, and they say, "Follow me," and you go through. And instead of a plate with 12 loaves of bread on it, there's a glyph with 4 triangles connecting the zodiacal signs, which are lined up also with the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 permutations, 12 of the permutations of Yod He Vav He, the divine name, and 12 angels that not 12 angels, but the point is there's little Catholic hosts on each of the 12, and they represent the 12 loaves of bread that were in the original tabernacle. Similarly, yes, the vault of the Adepti in the Rosicruciana, RR at AC, the Rose Rube et Ore Crucis, is based on and an elaboration of the original tomb which was described in the Fama Fraternitatis of the Rosicrucians. Mm-hmm. They described that after 120 years, I believe, or 100 years, they found someone was cleaning something and they were polishing it. There was a plaque up on a wall, and he was trying to get it off so he could polish the back of it, and he pulled it off, and part of the wall came off, and then they looked through, and there was this door, and so they opened the door, and there was the tomb of their founder. It must have stank in there. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe after 120 years it doesn't stink anymore. But
he was perfectly preserved.
He was perfectly preserved. That's the thing. That was it was like a miracle.
Like Paramahansa Yogananda.
Yeah. And in there, there were different things described. And so as you're being introduced to the vault, they're alluding to those original writings, and someone's putting them into context and saying, but here we see it's elaborated upon. Mm-hmm. And so, all these different, there's a particular altar that's described, and that's there in detail, but then there's things added to it, like a dagger, and I don't know if those things were in the original Fama, but then there's all those colorful squares, so that you have access to all the forces in the universe, in all universes all at once. And you stand in the center as the Christos, and which is, of course, Greek for the Anointed One, and it's explained. I don't know where this is written, but there was this guy, and we called him Fred or TSO, and just because I'm recording it, I won't say his real name. And he was an archaeologist. He would dig up new Eleusinian, sites that hadn't been dug up, and he had a team of people. He was working with the sort of the mafia in Sicily, which he was describing as being very different from the mafia here, because there it's just basically, if you want to do business in town, then when those guys come around, you say yes, oh thank you, and they say, do you need any help? And you say, no, we're good, well actually we're looking for this, and then they'll come around again one day and they'll say, we need your help. And you say yes. That was just basically what otherwise you're not going to be doing business in town. And when that carried over to New York and Chicago, there was a lot more guns involved and things. But out there, you're no longer welcome in the community, and they just shun you. So it's like a little bit more civilized, but kind of weird too. But anyway, he had a teacher who wrote a book called Eleusius. There's probably many, but he was a professor at a particular college in Switzerland, and I don't know the name of it. And so what TSO told me was that when you were in Eleusius in the olden days, you go through everybody who was initiated, the 10,000, 15,000 some odd people that were initiated into the rites of Eleusius. Slaves were admitted. Nero was not. They didn't acknowledge. You didn't have your class when you were there. It was separate from that. And everybody kept it secret, basically, for the most part. By the 4th century BC, there was satires being written about it, but before that, it was much more serious. Everything was much more serious before the 4th century BC. But anyway, what was I saying? Okay, so there was the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries, and the greater mysteries. Well, the lesser mysteries were, among other things, about Demeter, Persephone, Hades, seasons. A lot of basic stuff. And then the gods. You go and see Cronus' temple and see Zeus' temple and everything. And then in the greater mysteries, it was a little more severe and a little bit more reserved for the few, among them the hierophants of the lesser mysteries. And so after following Demeter around and working with all these Greek gods, Demeter takes you to and Demeter's had a veil on the entire time. In the outer mysteries, she's always wearing a veil. And in the greater mysteries, she's wearing a veil. And then you're brought to a tomb. And you're brought into the tomb. And a wooden Vesica Pisces, vagina, is placed on your head. And it symbolizes rebirth in the spirit. And they poured olive oil on you. And that was the moment that you transformed from a Mistos to a Christos. You were no longer an aspirant on the path.
Did people actually undergo changes of consciousness when this was happening?
That was the idea.
It just simply
it was
like
acted out.
An outer ritual representing that.
All we know is what was acted out. Hopefully for some of them it was genuine. For others they were like, this is weird, but they were possibly on psychedelics as well. But the point is, when they exited, they were told, now you are Osiris. You are no longer Jim. You are Osiris Jim. And you are the resurrected one. And you were Christos. And this was pre-Jesus, of course. Like, this is kind of interesting, to look at in context of the New Testament and how the Eleusinian mysteries ended up crossing paths historically with the Hebrew tradition to give birth to Christianity. But anyway, then when you exited the tomb, Demeter had her veil off, and she was Isis. And they were said, her real name is Isis. This is your wife. Now that you are Osiris, and you didn't marry her, but that was part of the ceremony. So yeah, I always thought that was an interesting sort of like a proto-history to the symbolism of the Golden Dawn and the symbolism of the Catholic Church, because you have everybody just pray to Mary, just pray for forgiveness, just pray the Rosary, and then for the real serious, people who want to get into it, then down the road, after many ring past knots, they say, become one with the body of Christ. Take these words of Paul to heart. The reason why they didn't want to translate it for so long was they didn't want the common folk to be like, well, is this about us or is this about the priests? Because then once it was translated, we were like, I think this is about us. We should be part of the body of Christ.
We are, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
and you don't need a cookie,
I think I mentioned when I was here visiting with you guys last week or whatever it was, about a book called The Road to Eleusius, which is about the Eleusinian mysteries. And it had 3 authors, Albert Hoffman, who discovered LSD 25, and Gordon Wasson and somebody else. And what they have done in that, it's a small little book, but what they've done in that book is they've made a very strong case for the idea that part of the initiation into those mysteries involved a psychedelic experience where
Yeah.
the person, they were blindfolded and they went through some kind of a tunnel or something, and they had to spend several hours going through this passageway.
Waiting for it to kick in.
Well,
they're probably given a drink.
After it had kicked in.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a drink they had, but they used the ergot
Gaikan?
fungus on rye.
Kaikian.
The ergot fungus that grows on rye was one of the ingredients. And they have pictures of all these different plants from which these things were derived on the goblets that they drank out of and stuff. But that was a definite rebirth kind of ritual.
I know it's hard to get away with the OTO does it. That's why I'm a little jealous of the Thelemites because they'll go ahead and cross that line. They'll be like, you know what? We're going to do this initiation on LSD, like that. More so than the Golden Dawn. Not every OTO order or lodge is like that, by the way. But some of them that use the name OTO, at least at the parties.
Well, I for one, after reading that book and considering several things, I think that was part of that tradition.
Yeah.
But before somebody went through that process or that initiation, there was quite a lengthy period of preparation they had to undergo.
Yeah.
So that it was like a technology to it, so that when they went through this, everybody would have the same spiritual experience.
Yeah.
And they had to be prepared psychologically and spiritually for that ahead of time.
Yeah.
And then there were like people who were candidates, and only some of those candidates were selected to continue on in and go through the experience. And it was all kept very hush-hush.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. Interesting.
They make a real good case in that book about it.
Which book?
The Road to Elysium.
Oh, right. The Road to Elysium. Very nice.
Yeah, that book, I think it came out in the 70s.
Okay, here's a question. It's sort of a different question, but related to the interview. When my dad in the 60s would teach, what did he do? Was he saying this is how to read tarot in the Celtic cross spread? Or was he putting one card in front of you with a candle? What was the process? Do you remember?
Well, what I experienced was I experienced him doing tarot readings for people.
I remember that.
Doing readings and getting intuitions from his inner guidance and telling people things about what they could expect in their life or what they were dealing with or would have to deal with. And I think that, I don't know if he was conscious of this at the time, but I think he actually foretold to me that I was going to be going to live in Alaska.
Huh.
And this was several years, before I had any thought of doing that.
Yeah. Interesting. Did
But
he
he was
say something
talking
about a
about
long
this-
journey?
Yeah, journey and by yourself and all this
7
stuff.
or 8 of swords. One
Yeah,
of
it
those
was
with
one
the
of
boat.
those. It was one of those things with the boat.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was drawing out of it all this additional information.
Yeah.
And then another one that he predicted that came true in a strange way was having to do with an attempt at a political revolution,
Nice.
an upheaval.
That was pre-68. That was like.
Yeah. In fact, well, the one about with the swords and the boat and all that might have been in the 60s too. I'm not really clear
Yeah.
as to when it was. But it wasn't until 83 that I actually moved from Boulder, Colorado to Anchorage.
Yeah. Did he burn incense or dim the lights or anything?
Yeah, he had the lights down and he created a nice ambience.
Yeah.
Very nice ambience, candlelight.
But no beard back then.
No, the beard came a little later.
It's a trip to think about that because I knew him as the tarot reader,
Well, I'll tell you another story about him now.
Mhm.
I should tell you. Well, when he predicted about this thing regarding a political revolution, there was someone that I knew as a student at UC Irvine, who was kind of a wild person, who was into psychedelics and into tarot and into Eastern mysticism and stuff. And something went wrong with him. He moved, after graduation, he moved up to Oakland, California, and he got involved with someone who he said was a wizard up there. And when I was living in a flat in San Francisco, he came up and visited me. And at this point, this was like in the late 60s. He had completely changed from being on kind of a spiritual path to more of a political revolutionary path. And he started participating in these protests, like in Berkeley and Oakland and so forth. They would refer to the police as pigs, and he would talk about pig psychology, and he was identifying himself with the emperor card, saying that he was going to be an emperor and that there was going to be this big revolution. And then one night in the kitchen, he just horrified me, where he started talking about things getting so organized in this organization he was with, that there would be people with nuclear weapons blowing up all the major cities in the United States. And he was kind of narrating it like
Tyler Durden from Fight Club, it sounds like.
He was narrating it like a sportscaster saying, "Oh, and here goes New York City, here goes Chicago, and here goes LA," and he was really kind of flipped out. I mean, he wanted this to happen. He was in tune with some diabolical force, that he was getting a lot of energy and power from, and he tried to recruit me to join his organization. So that was where the connection was, which your dad had predicted, in this tarot reading years before.
Yeah.
He was trying to convert me, or recruit me, and I wanted nothing to do with it. He had this woman with him who had been clubbed in one of the demonstrations at the Democratic Convention in 1968, in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And she was, full of the same kind of rage and so forth.
Yeah.
And so he and her were going to go to participate in some march over in Berkeley, and they expected to get thrown in jail. And I said, well, I'll try to send you some good energy. He says, don't send love. Don't send any of that kind of energy.
Wow.
So it was pretty bad. And then, as things went on, he realized he wasn't going to persuade me, to join them. And he launched a psychic attack on me.
Huh.
He sent me stuff in the mail, and I was having, dreams about him and stuff, and it was kind of bad. I mean, he was doing it because he'd been kicked out of the flat.
Right.
It was only because I'd invited him in as a friend that he was there, and he was giving a bad time to some of the other people that lived there. They didn't want him there.
Yeah.
But he was trying to attack me psychically, and he became involved with an organization that was in the news at the time called the SLA, which stood for Sylenes Liberation Army or something. And this group of people, they kidnapped the heiress, Patty Hearst.
Oh.
Yeah, we saw that.
Yeah.
They kidnapped her, and she actually converted.
Wow, yeah.
To them and participated in.
When did we see that?
In a
That was
robbery
on
and stuff.
Drunk History, yeah. So we got a sort of version of that.
You got a little taste of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the guy who was the wizard, who was like his leader, had a certain way of speaking. He came on the radio, and the way he was speaking was identical to the way this guy I knew had started speaking. So he had sort of like imprinted that guy's personality.
Yeah.
And so that's how I
probably through sleep deprivation
was able to tell there was a connection between them.
Wow.
And he had sent me like a broken mirror and a bunch of stuff that he had written and all that. And I took that with me when I went down to LA, and I brought it to your dad.
Huh.
This is where your dad comes in. And I told your dad what was going on. And so your dad, proceeded to do kind of like a little ceremonial thing. It's kind of a psychic thing. And he said that your dad said that he was working with a African American woman who was into voodoo, and that there were a few other people that he'd attacked, and he wanted to see if he could stop it, but your dad wasn't able to stop it. He said the guy, he's too strong. I can't break this thing, but I can see what's going on, and he will continue attacking you. So your dad took me over to a place that some friends of his had, and it was a store in Pasadena called the Three Wizards. And one of them was a man.
The Wizards 3.
Wizards 3, yeah.
Yeah, they became the Crystal Cave.
One of them was a man named Dick Quinn, that your dad knew. And my sister also, I think, knew him from the VOTA or something. But anyway, we went over there, and he introduced me to Dick Quinn and told him what was happening. And Dick Quinn asked me to give him, the stuff the guy had sent. And he took it kind of like in a back room. And I don't know what he did, but he did something back there. And then he came back out, and he told me that the guy would never be able to attack me again, that things had been fixed so that whenever he sends out any negative energy to attack anybody, it will immediately come back and attack him.
Nice.
So it's going to recycle straight, sort of like instant karma.
Yeah.
Instead of karma in your next life or whatever, it will recycle back. So he won't be able to attack anybody. And your dad was describing him as having experienced some of that energy coming back to him. He said he was doubled over in pain, holding his gut, and that he was asking that voodoo woman to help him, and she couldn't help him. And then Dick Quinn said to me that Dick Quinn has like some female guides that he was working with on the inner plane. Those guides had told him that this guy had left some of his clothing in my room, in my flat in San Francisco, and that he was using that as a base to come there astrally and attack me. And he said, get rid of that. Get that stuff, anything that, was his, get it out of your place, because then he won't be able to use that.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it was right there. And he had done some kind of a spell on it so that I didn't pay attention to it. He put like a ring pass knot or something on it. And I had just never thought about it. I saw it sitting there, but it was like it didn't register. I never thought, oh yeah, that was Tony's and I should get it out of here. So, he was a pretty powerful guy, I guess, in what he was doing.
Wow.
So I got that stuff out of there. He couldn't attack anymore, and he told me to bury the broken glass, and basically it just kind of put him out of business. And then after I was in San Francisco, a couple of weeks later, I had a dream with this guy in it, and the guy was asking me if I would help him to heal some of the other people he'd attacked.
Huh.
And I told him to fuck himself. That's your baby, it's not mine.
Oh, it's all coming back on him.
Yeah, it all came back on him.
Oh.
So he wouldn't be able to
launch good
attacks on anybody again.
So I would imagine, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but I imagine one of the things that they were doing, the Liberation Army, was to postpone, because this is something a few others were into, to postpone karmic repercussions for actions in this life to another life. Mm-hmm. And then just pretend that doesn't exist, and then live this life wreaking as much havoc as...
Well, what they were involved in doing was, at these different marches and things, they would go there as agitators and use psychic influence to incite people to do violence.
Makes me think of some of the things that were going on with Occupy.
Well, Occupy was really mild.
Right.
I mean, we had these riots down in Watts where they were starting to burn the city down. Mm. They were involved in that. In fact, the head of the SLA was a African-American man named Sin Q, and he actually met his end within a year of this down in Watts in a burning house. And I mean, they had weapons. They were shooting people.
Yeah.
And what their hope was to get enough people rioting and doing violence to bring the country down. But they really didn't have a hope in hell of doing that. But they wanted to recruit more people to work for their cause, and that's why he tried to recruit me. There was like the Black Panthers, and then there were the White Panthers. The White Panthers wore these red berets. The Black Panthers wore black berets. And a couple of times when I was getting off of work at my job, there were these guys in red berets standing around. And that was all to intimidate me, because what he had threatened to do was to kidnap me. Because they had kidnapped other people. And they did, they kidnapped Patty Hearst. Yeah. And once you're kidnapped, they would give you LSD, and then they would, when you were vulnerable, they would psychically go to work on you to try to either convert you or totally flip you out.
Yeah.
A very evil thing. But thanks to your dad, I was freed from having to deal with that.
That is a very interesting story.
Yeah, it was one I was wanting to tell you.
Yeah. Huh.
Your dad was able to psychically read and see what was going on.
Yeah.
But by himself, he wasn't able to stop it, so he went to his friends.
Yeah. Yeah, the Wizards 3, my parents, when they were doing magic, just what I remember from stories back in the 70s, they were using incense from the Wizards 3. And when I was 14, 15, I started getting into magic. I dug up, we had all their old incense just in the kitchen up on a high counter, and my friend Isaac came over and he had Buckland's Kabbalistic, it was the Witchcraft Encyclopedia or something, and he said, I want to do one of these rituals, and you just need to get some incense, and I was like, well, I've got plenty of incense, and he saw, and it was like love, wealth, Merlin, dragon's blood, all these different things, and I was like, what is this? And yeah, I guess around that time I got this sort of sense of like walking in my father's footsteps by being a weirdo, and that sort of eventually led to that was shortly after he passed away too, so I was wanting to evoke him, in my own life sort of, and anyhow.
Yeah, I think Diane had a friend from the BOTA that was like an apprentice at the Wizards 3. She could tell you more about that than I could. But,
and then they got into the science of characteristics and est. And,
yeah, he got into that.
Yeah.
Well, one other thing that Dick Quinn told me, he gave me one of the Psalms to read. And he said to just picture that guy with his back to you going away from you and read this psalm every day for a month, and I did.
Nice.
That also helped to get rid of them. Well, the Psalms are a very powerful prayer book, thing to use.
There's a book
for
called
various situations.
Anna Riva's Psalm Magic or something like that, And then there's different, with the Shemham-Fresh, the 72 angels, each have psalms attributed to them. And so when you're evoking them, you use certain divine names and certain sigils, and then you read the psalm.
Yeah, well, it was when your dad was really involved in est that he wrote the Transformations.
Yeah.
And that inspired. He used some of the lingo that Werner Erhard came out with. He was quite enthusiastic about that.
Yeah. Yeah, he, I guess one of the things that was borrowed from L. Ron Hubbard was the Note of Mystery scale, the emotional tone scale with the Note of Mystery scale alongside of it, as it existed in the 70s. It was sort of a ongoing project after he died and everything. But I remember it was one of those guys, I don't know exactly who it was, that founded est, was Scientology was going after him because he was basically taking a lot of their stuff and
Werner Erhard, I think, was his...
That was him?
In Scientology.
Yeah,
He's the founder of est. Est stood for Erhard Seminar Training.
But he, I would say I'm bored, and so my dad would get out the book and pull out the emotional tone scale and say, okay, so you're here. You don't want to go down to anger, right? right? So do you want to go to one of these other emotions?
Who would say they were bored?
I would.
Oh, you
I
would.
was like 5,
so he
6.
He would offer you a little
map.
Journeys into these different states of the emotional
Yeah, he'd say, well,
experience.
do you want to be bored? Do you like being bored, or do you want to be something else? Because the other emotions are up here. You can be bored, sure, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with being bored. It's on the positive side of the scale, it's like the lowest of the positive emotions. You could be interested, you could be cheerful if you want, or not, pick one. My stepmom was making a bust. She was commissioned to make a bust of Einstein for Caltech, which is now in brass in Einstein's room.
Oh.
But when she was making it, she kept accidentally making my dad. And she kept having to say, no, John.
Really?
Yeah.
So it just automatically came about. That's something.
Yeah. She kept having to go, no, Einstein.
They weren't ready for a bust of John Dan Reib.
Oh, one thing I wanted to mention, in the interview between you and my dad, where you interviewed him, just for the record here, there's an interview. If you Google John Dan Reib interview, you can find it. It's under Google Documents. It's 90 minutes. Kess Frey interviewing my dad on Thursday, July 26th, 1990, in Sierra Madre Canyon. So that's what, poetically, one of the reasons I wanted to interview Kess was in light of that. But also because he's a wealth of information about Tibetan Buddhism, about which I'm very interested, as well as this guy hung out on Alan Watts' houseboat, and he's sort of ho-hum about it. He's more interested in the Lama he met there. Which Lama was it? Was this one?
Lama Anagarika Govinda.
Yeah, here we go.
He was a German-born man who converted to Buddhism when he was around 20 and was a monk in Ceylon for a number of years, and they sent him as a representative to go and debate with the Buddhists in northern India who were of the Mahayana and Vajrayana persuasions. And he got snowed in in Sikkim and had to spend the winter there. And during that course, he became a Tibetan Buddhist. His guru, Tomo Geshe Rinpoche, he met him, and so he an incredible man. He spoke 7 languages fluently. And
Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism is the book he wrote.
It's one of the earliest books written for people in the West on Tibetan meditation and mysticism. And he came from the West, so he's very good at communicating with Westerners.
But the thing I wanted to mention was toward the end, you guys were talking about what is wrong, with the world right now, or then, and it hasn't gotten that much better. It's just different now. It's very different. And there's things that I've noticed, and that's what leads me to my point. It was a big problem with television, especially network television, with commercial advertising, and its saturation in our world then, in 1990, and now even more so, because we've got it on our personal screen that we're always looking at, whether it's in our phone or we've got ads popping up, every other minute. But he had mentioned that one possible solution he saw came possibly through narrowcasting, and he used the example of Andrew DePasano running a public access show for people who were interested in what he had to teach, and that people tuned into that. And so I've heard that interview many times in the years since I was 15 when I first heard it after my dad passed away. And YouTube came about, and I that was one of the things that really inspired me to jump on that. As soon as I realized that there was a platform for any old Joe like me to go get a $200 camera and edit some stuff with some pirated Final Cut Pro, I'll edit that part out. And put something up there that anyone in the world can see. I jumped on it, and I played around with it. a lot of this stuff was really frivolous. I was practicing, for a number of years, and then more recently I put some serious stuff up, which I'll show you. I don't think I've showed you very many of them. But anyway, yeah, I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts about maybe a possible connection between streaming video and that kind of media opening up possibilities for evolution of human consciousness beyond where we were stunted before for generations of people sitting there eating their TV dinners and watching whatever the media thought that we should be watching.
Well, I think there's a tremendous potential in that. The mass media in general, I think, is inadvertently, or maybe in some cases intentionally, keeping people's consciousness kind of stuck within the parameters of the mindset of what we call the false self system and centering prayer.
Yeah.
Most advertising appeals to these different programs for happiness, more material possessions and wealth and stuff, more affection, esteem, and approval from others, or more power and control, so forth, more pleasure and sensation, or intimacy and a sense of belonging and fulfillment, to try to fill in the hole in our soul, which is there because we have lost contact with the spiritual center within us. That is our true nature. We are both human beings and spiritual beings. And we've become over-identified with a separate self-sense of our human personality, our ego, and we're totally under-identified with that deep inner core of our spiritual self.
Yeah.
So I think that the mess that the world is in, or that we're all in, can be traced back to this basic ignorance of our true nature as spiritual beings. So anything that will help to bring this to people's attention and make them aware of the fact that there are ways of making contact with that within each person there is a center of wisdom, peace, strength, understanding, a divine center that we can all access, which is the only solution to filling in that hole in our soul. It would be of tremendous value.
Yeah.
And we would be less dependent and reliant upon and addicted to external substitutes for that are being marketed to us by commercial interests, the mass media, and our cultural conditioning. So getting free of the cultural conditioning is one of the positive things that sometimes people will experience when they have a psychedelic experience, where temporarily their consciousness sort of jumps out of that box and they see things briefly from the perspective of their deep inner self, their spiritual self. And it's a whole new reality,
Yeah.
as anyone can attest who's experienced that, whether it's through meditation, any type of peak experience, or something facilitated by a sacred substance. And there's many ways of experiencing that.
Yeah.
But the real goal is for us to grow into and become that in our day-to-day life, not simply to look at the possibility and then come back and say, yeah, well, that was nice. I wish it could be like that all the time.
Yeah.
It can be like that.
Yeah.
But we have to do the inner work on ourselves in cooperation with that divine presence in us. Carl Jung had the term, what he called the Transcendent Function within the unconscious, which is this inner being within us that will work to heal and transform us and bring us into our true self. I think it's something that's natural to our operating system as human beings, just as our bodies physically grow naturally, provided they're given what they need to do that. The same thing with our consciousness and our soul. If we create the right conditions within ourselves, we will naturally flourish and blossom into the spiritual beings that we were intended to be. But I do think that the media, and particularly animated media and other forms, are ways in which this can be communicated to people with today's consciousness and in today's world. I may be wrong, but I suspect that less people are doing the type of research that involves studying and reading books and so forth, that used to be done when I was growing up, because that was the primary way to do it.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that are available now did not exist at that time. So the message, the content, needs to be adapted to the new media of communicating it in order for it to get out there. Like if it could be presented on YouTube or however.
Yeah.
It'd be tremendous value. But basically, I think the way things will change permanently for the better is if our consciousness changes and evolves. And that's one person at a time.
Yeah.
But groups of people can do that together. And all of that is feeding positive energy into the collective psyche, or what Desjardins called the noosphere of the human race. And it reverberates back on everyone else on the planet and can help to raise the consciousness of everyone who's willing and trusting to let go of attachment to that false self system of over-identification with the ego and its delusional programs for happiness, and realize that there's far better potential that we all have waiting for us to uncover and awaken.
Yeah.
If you're a Buddhist, you call it your Buddha nature, for example. If you're a Christian, you would call it the Christos within you, the divine indwelling, the divine Trinity.
Yeah.
The names given are just names, but what the reality of it is beyond language, beyond concepts. We can't nail it down with concepts, but we can point to it with symbols and ideas and language. The main thing is for that to become alive in us so that we can grow into it and become who we really are. And the more people that do that, the more love there is in the world as a result of that, the more goodwill of people to people, the better off our planet will be. And of course we need to take care of our planet's ability to sustain healthy organic life.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we won't be able to live here.
Yeah, we're just starting to realize we have the potential to screw it all up.
We're well on the road to doing that.
Yeah.
And there are false self-interests of a economic greedy nature that are willing to trash the planet for the sake of getting short-term financial gratification and gain, thinking, well, as I said the other day when I was here, it's not going to be my problem when the world's all screwed up because I'll be dead and gone.
Yeah.
But if those people realized about the truth of reincarnation, they'd realize it will be, because the world we leave behind is the world we're going to be reborn into.
Yeah.
So even from that very selfish point of view, people have a vested interest in the well-being of our planet in the future.
Yeah.
For evolution to be able to continue. So we all have a responsibility. I think the most important thing anybody can do is to work on their own spiritual growth and the awakening of their own consciousness, so that that can be contributed to the collective. Because we certainly know there's a tremendous amount of negativity in the collective from all the terrible things that are happening on the world and that are being broadcast through the news and everywhere. It's creating rings of fear surrounding the planet and causing discouragement and depression and hopelessness. And there's no need for that. I mean, there's a difficult situation, but there is something we can each do, and if enough of us are doing it, even though we don't have the money and the power and the influence, our spiritual influence will turn the tide.
Yeah, I'm encouraged when I hear things like that. If 1% or if half of 1% of the human race were to be enlightened or to be in a state of compassion, that it would have a sort of 100th monkey effect.
Absolutely.
The human race would wake up.
I think that's really true, because the same divine presence is already inside of everybody. It's already there. And it's just a question of it being nourished.
Yeah.
Stimulated, and people will respond to that, because that's where true fulfillment and happiness are. It's not in all these other substitute things that we get so enamored of and chase after, in terms of materialistic values or pleasure and excitement and stimulation, drama, affection, esteem, approval, fame, power, control, domination, over-identification with our group and our cultural conditioning. I mean, these are all things that have relative good to them. They're not wrong, but when it's overdone and used as a substitute for God in our life or for our spiritual life, then it becomes a sickness. And that's what we're stuck with. That's what we're having to overcome. That's what's creating the negativity that is threatening the future of our well-being as a species.
Yeah. Yesterday, the Karmapa published an article in which it was about resolving conflict, and the whole article was about when there's a state of conflict. The best thing that you can do is work on yourself and be free of it. Don't be locked in the conflict. Acknowledge that you might not win, and that it might take many years to resolve the conflict, and that it goes on about working on yourself, and at the end he says, and in the end, if you do all these things, the whole world.
Yeah, and that is so true. We can't allow the negativity of conflict or tragic events to destroy our own peace of mind.
Yeah.
So, we need to acknowledge the truth of it, but we also need to acknowledge that within us there is this center of peace and strength and wisdom and love that is who we truly are and what we truly are, and to nourish that in others and in ourselves. Forgiveness is so important. That was one of the fundamental teachings of Jesus, was forgive one another. Love one another as I have loved you. Forgiveness gives us peace of mind and it frees us. We can become detached from conflict rather than over-identified with and caught up in it, sucked into it, allowing it to take over our consciousness. And that's what we're in danger of doing if we overexpose ourselves to too much negative news, too much negativity. So there needs to be a balance between our outer life and our inner spiritual life. We need to take some time for ourselves, just to be quiet and to go inside and meditate and make contact with that deeper inner center within us. I think that's one of the dangers of the increased amount of external stimulation that people are getting from all the new media and the electronics, is that people can get so addicted to looking at screens that becomes their whole life, and they lose themselves. They don't develop a sense of who they really are or what their purpose is. Our real purpose that we all have is to contribute to our own spiritual growth and the evolution of humanity and the planet. Using those things, but not allowing them to become our master.
Yeah.
We're not becoming so addicted and dependent on them that we don't know what to do with ourselves if we don't have a screen to look at.
Yeah.
That's a slavery situation. Degrading. And the content of what's on those screens is the crucial thing. It's going to make all the difference. If it's just superficial, meaningless, and negative, it's going to poison people's minds.
It makes me think of... Oh, sorry.
If there's positive content, good messages, encouraging people, then
but even
it will
still,
be beneficial.
Even still, like in many, in the Yoga Sutras, and I believe probably the Buddha said there's the iron chain and the golden chain, and the iron chain is bad karma, and the golden chain is good karma.
They're both chains.
Yeah. So you got to let go of the chains,
That's right.
Whether they be gold or lead. There was a point where I got some very positive feedback from one of my yoga classes, and I felt this euphoric feeling of, and I wrung it in. I was like, ring it in. Because if I expect myself not to feel devastated when I get criticized, then I need to reel it in when I get complimented and just humbly say thank you, and move on. And
humility is our best protection against all temptations.
It takes vigilance sometimes, though.
And I think you deserve to enjoy that positive feedback.
Yeah.
But don't expect to have it all the time, or
Or
don't
get
get depressed They don't get addicted to it or depressed if it's not there, because that's not you. You don't
Another
need
addiction.
that.
Yeah.
It's icing on the cake, and it's nice, and you deserve it. But be detached from it.
Yeah.
Don't allow that golden chain to put you in chains.
Harp transition provided by Camille and Kennerly, their rendition of Game of Thrones. Thank you, Kess Frey. That was lovely. Had a wonderful time. I don't consider myself to be an authority as much as many people that I know. So if you're listening to these episodes and it's just painful because of how ignorant I am or how ignorant my guests are, please call 626-367-9254. Let me know where I've gone astray and what books I should be reading instead of the ones that I've read, and or whatever it is. If you want to call me up and just say hello and check in, you don't have to be the main interview, so if you want to just call and, have a 5-minute little hello, little shout out to my favorite kind of voodoo or whatever, you can use an alias if you'd like. Anytime. 24/7. Doesn't matter what day it is. Right now. Just turn off the podcast and call. 626-367-9254. We'll be in the next episode of Very Honored Frater BT's Esoterinerd podcast. Thank you for listening. Good night.